This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I'm delighted and it's with great pleasure that I can introduce today's keynote, which is Dr. Malcolm Quinn, who is the Associate Dean of Research and Director of the Graduate School for Camberwell, Chelsea and Wimbledon Colleges of Arts at University of the Arts. He's written two single-authored books that trace firstly the aesthetic of politics in 20th century fascism, and secondly, the intellectual history of politics of the aesthetic in 19th century Britain. Between the publication of these two books, he collaborated with Professor Danny Nobis of Brunel University on a study of psychoanalytical approaches to knowledge and identity. This collaborative research has informed the analysis of the utilitarian conversion in 19th century thought and its role in defining a new politics of art and taste, which is a key thought, that is offered in his latest book, Utilitarianism and the Art School in 19th Century Britain, published by Pickering and Chatto 2012. Regarding today's paper and its title, Malcolm has submitted a fabulous title, Set the Day Off, and I'm going to say no more except it's The Plot Against the Future. Malcolm.
Right. Hello and thanks everyone. I'd like to thank the members of the Conference Committee of Memories of the Future for the invitation to speak to you today, and Stephen for the piano, which I'll be playing in a minute. My presentation is about the difference between a desire for future satisfaction and the social organization of satisfaction in the future. A focus on this difference will allow the outlines of what I'm calling the plot against the future to emerge. At one point yesterday, Professor Abruzzese referred to radical anti-humanist thinking as prompted by the idea that humanism is not a sufficient guarantee of what it is to be human. My presentation draws on a similar view of humanism on the part of Jeremy Bentham, who is hanging about nearby, somewhere in a box. Specifically, Bentham's view that the humanism of David Hume, I've done some work on this, particularly in matters of taste, was not a sufficient guarantee of what it is to be human. Bentham's anti-humanism and his attack on Hume depended on the reduction of complex human passions, Hume's concerns, to radically anti-humanist units of pleasure, which could be used to build ethical social assemblages of pleasures and interests. Bentham proposed this reduction of passion to pleasure in the cause of a shift in ethical coordinates, in which the Aristotelian notion of the ethical perfection of the self was replaced by the perfection of ethical social assemblages of pleasure. To take one example that Bentham uses, the Malthusian goal of the reduction of population can be expressed in a new social goal of satisfaction that promotes the pleasures of homosexuality. He was very radical in this respect. The reduction of passion to pleasure, which makes such social assemblages possible, transforms satisfaction from a felt social need to an explicit social goal. It establishes a difference between my desire for future satisfaction, which might prompt my time travel, and the social organization of satisfaction in the future, which is a completely different thing. But what is perhaps most interesting about the manner in which Jeremy Bentham accomplishes this shift from Aristotelian ethics, in which I have an ontological destination, to utilitarian ethics, was Bentham's use of fictions. That is, terms that are understood contextually within a situation that gives them meaning. To use the example under discussion, the reference point of passion is complex and human, but to be grasped and used in its social context, passion must become pleasure. That's the point that Bentham made, and that's where you have this idea of fiction. It doesn't mean reference. It means change of use, or rather, to be used, it must change. Rather than referring passion to the human, as is done in humanism, what the utilitarian ethicist should do was to turn complex individual passions into units of pleasure, thereby establishing the possibility that satisfaction could become a social aim. One of the intriguing things about Bentham is that his anti-humanism sits at the beginning of the regular, punctual social time of industrialization that Professor Abruzzese referred to yesterday, but it sits oddly within it. The social aim of satisfaction is not commensurate with the social aims of industrialization, and Bentham rejected quite explicitly any notion of the duty of industry. He said there can be no such thing. And to refer again to Professor Abruzzese's presentation, while we may now consume House of Cards on Netflix in a way that shows little respect for regular social time, one could not claim that this kind of usage proves that satisfaction has become established as a primary social aim, because it hasn't. Bentham's theory of fictions is important for this presentation because it allows the future to be used contextually rather than as a reference point, enabling a shift from the reference point of my satisfaction in the future to the context of a future social meaning of satisfaction. So, the first part of my presentation introduces some themes and ideas that will establish the difference between the promise of future satisfaction and satisfaction in the future. I will then show how these themes and ideas establish the characteristics of what I call the plot against the future in two texts from the interwar years. Zygmunt Kurzajzanowski's story, Memories of the Future. Anyone here read that? Oh God, you've got to read it. And Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities. I will then use Kurzajzanowski's emphasis on the central role played by the clock and clock consciousness in the plot against the future to distinguish this actual plot, this actual threat, from pseudo-plots or pseudo-alarms or pseudo-threats about the future. The last part of my presentation will focus on planet Kakania, the reconstruction of Austro-Hungary on the eve of World War I that is made by Robert Musil in The Man Without Qualities. Musil's book is brilliant and important because it isolates the plot against the future under laboratory conditions by lifting it out of the stream of historical time. In this way, Musil shows us how serious the plot against the future actually is because of the manner in which it can occupy and colonize the present. That's my introduction. To begin the main bit. What's the point of time travel? Satisfaction, of course. But what kind of satisfaction? I will introduce three positions on satisfaction under three different headings. Scenarios for satisfaction, knowledge of satisfaction, and, most importantly, the division of satisfaction. Of these three positions, only the first two, scenarios for satisfaction and knowledge of satisfaction, belong together. Taken together, these first two establish a relationship between, firstly, technological fantasies of the satisfaction that can be obtained through travel in time, and secondly, the terminus of these fantasies in knowledge about a social reality in which that satisfaction is denied or repressed. The emphasis here is on time travel as a planned journey towards satisfaction that is revealed as impossible or fantastical through critical analysis that produces knowledge about satisfaction. Disillusionment, academic, The third position, the division of satisfaction, does not correspond with these first two. It uses a time machine to divide the knowledge about satisfaction that has been made available under the conditions of its social repression from the truth of satisfaction as a social aim, such as the shift from population control to homosexual pleasure. I'm employing the word truth here in a particular way with reference to the social truth of Bentham's fictions. Truth that is put to work in a time machine here becomes a kind of Benthamite fiction because it uses the things of the world in a way that the world does not use them. And that's shameless borrowing from Carl Andre, by the way. He says, I want to use the things of the world in the way the world does not use them, which I think is also brilliant. And to put this another way, the time machine is a new context for the things of the world. That's how I want to see it. It's a new context for the things of the world. In this sense, a time machine is not an object that looks different from all other objects, like the padded Victorian weirdness of H.G. Wells. It is a different use of objects in the world that violates the current conditions of knowledge. The difference here is a difference between not getting what you want, which is the basis of the fantasy of obtaining satisfaction through travel in time, and not wanting what you get, because the things that you get only have one set of instructions. And so you think, this is no good. I've got to rearrange the things of the world in a way the world doesn't tell me to do it. If I build a time machine as a new kind of object in the world with the intention of using it to get out of this world, I will find, of course, as we all know, that this is impossible and I'm stuck exactly where I started because that time machine has been built from the dissatisfaction that rules the world. On the other hand, if the time machine is constructed by a different use of the things of this world, I will find that I produce the future as a difference in the meaning of satisfaction in the present. I'm going to turn to the question of the different use of objects in the construction of time machines later in this presentation, with reference to Sigismund Kurzajzanowski's story, Memories of the Future. First, though, I want to take a quick tour through these three positions that I've mentioned on satisfaction. So, firstly, scenarios for satisfaction. The first form, which I'm calling scenarios for satisfaction, suggests that satisfaction can be obtained in the variety of scenarios for action that time travel offers. It takes a particular person as its starting point, let's call this person Marty McFly, and places this person in alternative scenarios linking past, present and future in ways that are more or less conducive to Marty McFly's well-being and satisfaction. One way, another way, try that, try this. So this begins with a being who is already fully formed, and it offers him alternative routes from the past into the future that can be obtained by purposeful agency, such as gaining an advantage, facing your fears, getting revenge, closing the deal, and finding the right partner. All the things that one does in time travel to sort it all out. And we all know this is a terrible fantasy. So then we come to the academics with their furrowed brows, who are engaged with knowledge of satisfaction. The second form, knowledge of satisfaction, subjects the satisfaction scenarios of the first discourse to a reality check. The payoff of this position is that you can at least know that you can't get what you want. You can obtain knowledge about satisfaction, but under the conditions set by the repression of satisfaction. In fact, that's a good definition of academic work as a whole. Knowledge about satisfaction under the conditions of the repression of satisfaction. This approach begins once again with a narrative of a particular person who's placed in scenarios, etc., etc., but it gives her a reality check by referring the narrative to its social and cultural contexts. It suggests that the dream of future satisfaction through the employment of some clever but implausible time travel technology about time traveling cars or DeLoreans will quickly be brought down to earth by rigorous socio-cultural analysis. So when you finish the rigorous socio-cultural analysis and brought pseudo-scientific idealism down to its knees, it will turn out, bless my soul, that all the stories about time travel are really stories about class or gender or capitalism or the commodity or all the other things that conspire to rob us of our satisfaction in the present. We can then conclude that that's how things really are with time travel. It's all about socially constructed ideas and wishes and fantasies, tant pis. The division of satisfaction is the final one. The third type is the one I will focus most on. It's the one I introduced at the beginning. It does not begin with a being like Marty McFly, who is already fully formed before the narrative begins. Instead, its project is to form the being that is needed for the time travel or the transition to be accomplished. The being that is required is someone who can accept the fullest implications of the premise that the aim of time travel is satisfaction. This being is different from us. They are already in the future because their social aim is satisfaction and not the social repression of satisfaction. I've called this third aspect the division of satisfaction because here the point of time travel is to divide everything we know about satisfaction through the various forms of its repression from the truth of satisfaction as a social aim. The time traveller therefore already marks out a difference in the present, a difference in the way things are talked about and used. How do you know they're a time traveller? They talk about things differently, they use things differently. That's how we know that they're a time traveller. Because they're in a different context than us. They've formed a different context. So if you want to know how you tell a time traveller, that's it. That's simple, really. So if you see someone talking about things differently and using them differently, they're a time traveller. It's good to know this. Of course, we'll all forget about this difference in the present if the time traveller then goes whizzing off to redecorate their scenarios and gaining advantages and so forth and so on. And what we've all forgotten about as this occurs is that all these redecorations take place under the conditions of repression. Pursuing alternative scenarios for myself in the past and the future will inevitably bring about not an alternative route from the past into the future, but more dissatisfaction for me in the present, which in turn will breed the compensatory fantasy of new scenarios for action, which will then be countered by an academic reality check. But if instead of all these redecorations and refurbishments of the past and future, we can focus on the difference that the time traveller makes in the present, there is no need for a reality check, because the time traveller, by the way they speak and they use, makes this reality check for us. They check reality, they put reality in check in some way. Anyone that does this, however, will have to renounce the idealism and technological wish fulfillment that is implicit in their wish to alter, refurbish, redecorate, or make over their personal timeline. So, what time have we? Oh, good Lord. It's running out. So, having introduced the three forms of satisfaction, my answer to the question, what's the point of time travel, which I began with, can be summarized as follows. The point of time travel is to divide everything we know about satisfaction through its repression from the truth of satisfaction as a social aim. This is accomplished by using the things of the world in a way the world doesn't use them. So, how does this relate to the plot against the future? The plot against the future is a plot to ensure that everything we know about satisfaction is produced by the social repression of satisfaction. This prevents us from using the things of the world in the way the world does not use them. This means that the future is a world in which the truth of satisfaction has become a social aim. Anyone who wants to get to this future will have to focus on the practical matter of the construction of a time machine, that is, some way to establish a memory of the future, a non-standard form of transmission from the past into the present that will produce the future as a difference in the present. The tug of war between the future and the plot against the future is the subject of Zygmunt Korzeniowski's story, Memories of the Future, written in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. The story is about a man called Max Sterer, who, against the odds, builds a time machine in Russia following the revolution, while running out of the time, money and resources that he needs to construct it. That's one of the ironies. The author of Memories of the Future, Korzeniowski, had his short stories rejected by Soviet editors as untimely and inappropriate for post-revolutionary Russia. Maxim Gorky, chairman of the Union of Soviet Writers, commented that Korzeniowski's stories might unhinge young minds. One can only hope. They were not published in Russia until 1989. In his turn, Korzeniowski said that the revolution had turned Russia into a theatre where improvisation was forbidden and only canonical texts were performed. So in Memories of the Future, Max Sterer, the central characters, experiments in time travel begin in childhood with swapping the hour hand with the minute hand of the clock. His aim is to stop time marching on in the clock and make it dance in a circle instead. One of the most interesting aspects of Memories of the Future is the way that Korzeniowski differentiates the time in which Max's time machine has to get funded, resourced, built and accounted for to others under constantly deteriorating conditions, from, on the other hand, the consciousness of time that is produced wherever Max provides descriptions and accounts of his machine, because then he becomes the time traveller who, through the way he talks and uses, reveals himself to already be in the future. Max Sterer gives two descriptions of his time machine in Memories of the Future. The first is delivered to a school friend before the time machine is built. The second is given to a skeptical audience of writers and intellectuals after his return from the future in the time machine. The fact that the first description is before the construction of the time machine and the second after its construction is less relevant than the separation that Korzeniowski makes between the time of the future, which is the time when he's describing his machine and marking out this new context, and the time of the plot against the future, which is the time of the machine's construction. That's the important time difference, not the time of the future that he goes off into the machine and comes back from. The first account of the time machine, I'm going to quote a bit here, what I want to pay attention to here is the question of reusage of things. The first account of the time machine is given when Max explains it to his school friend Ichia in the following way. So this is the description of the time machine. He hasn't built it yet. The temporal selector, as I now see it, will have the shape of a pointed glass hat, snugly covering the frontal and occipital bones. The focuses of the temperator's exceedingly fine flint glasses will intersect in such a way as to exclude the apparatus from sight even before launch. Then, once the machine is in operation, this invisibility should gradually spread from activated to activated, that is, to the brain in its transparent vise, the skull, neck, shoulders, and so on. Thus, a bullet's nickel-plated cap is excluded from sight by its flight, despite being present in space. Still, that's not the point. The time hiding under one's skull must be covered with a hat, like a moth with a net. But time has a billion wings and is far more easily frightened. Wearing an invisibility hat is the only way to catch it. I can't understand why the significance of the invisibility cap, invented by storytellers, remains to this day invisible to scientists. I get my material from all different places. As you can see, even fairy tales have their use. In this account of the time machine, the only word that might be unfamiliar to us is temporator. In other words, that's the only new object. All the other words are recognizable, and so are phrases like exceedingly fine, like a moth with a net, etc. But then we encounter exceedingly fine used in a sentence such as, the focuses of the temperator's exceedingly fine flint glasses will intersect in such a way as to exclude the apparatus from sight even before launch. And we realise that although Max is using the things of the world to construct his time machine, and that he obtains his material from all kinds of sources in this world, he is not using these things as the world uses them. The invisibility cap from the fairy tale, for example, is used to effect a separation between the normal state of scientific knowledge and the scientific knowledge as it is recreated in Max's description of the machine. If scientists have not so far grasped the use of the invisibility cap from the fairy tale, silly them, this is because they have no means of grasping it according to the law of satisfaction that differentiates the time of the machine's construction from the consciousness of time produced by Max's descriptions. When Sterer is asked to give an account of his time cutter to the invited audience later on after he's built it and come back, he says, "What I'm about to present will resemble a genuine presentation no more than, to quote Spinoza, an ordinary dog resembles the dog star." There's your different context. He also observes that, following the irrevocable change in his consciousness produced by his act of cutting into time, his audience now appear to him as automatons, quote, "people without a now, people whose present has been left behind, people with projected wills, whose words resemble the ticking of clocks wound long before." These people have become speaking clocks, literally. They got wound up, now they speak, whatever wound them up. And the only question you can ask them is, what makes you tick? If anyone ever asks you that, tell them something rude. I won't say now. The last words attributed to Max Sterer in the story are, "Take me to the land of those who understand." The land of those who understand is not an audience of the future or another audience in a different world or parallel universe. It is an audience in the here and now who, through their understanding, demonstrate that the future has been produced by using the things of the world in the way the world does not use them. Thank you, Carl Andre. To be in the land of those who understand is to have accomplished a profound shift that transports you into the future. This is a shift from a normal clock of consciousness, wound long ago, which merely ticks on and on, from the point where you become someone with a condition in the present. Having a condition in the present means being able to divide what you know through the clock of normal consciousness from the truth that is the future. At the end of Max Sterer's first description of the machine at school to his friend Ichia, who is now dying, his friend points to this shift in time consciousness when he says, as he's dying, I now feel better than I will ever feel again. So he's indicating, well, I'm going to carry on and die, but now you've shifted me into your context a bit. So, the plot against the future is a plot to maintain the pseudo-future of normal ticking consciousness that tells us the instructions for names and uses of the things in this world. This consciousness behaves like a clock that once wound ticks on and prevents the emergence of the actual future, which interrupts it. The future has arrived when a remarkable and unprecedented use of the things of this world establishes itself in the present. On the other hand, the pseudo-future arrives, and I saw it as I came in here with the post office tower, when someone points at something like the post office tower and declares it to be the harbinger of things to come. Again, the actual future is a difference in the present rather than being a somewhere else which is different from the present and that offers an alternative to it. In a recent discussion of, quote, consumer products that look set to shape the future on CNN, it's just a bit of advertorial, but it was so funny, quote, most people feel anxious when their smartphone is out of arm's reach. I know I do. But what if it was actually on your arm, woven into the very fabric of your sweater? Sportswear designers Under Armour are already on the case. They recently unveiled their touchscreen t-shirt concept, Armour 39, which measures your athletic performance. We can either laugh at the absurdity of this or be worried about the further integration of normal tick-tock time consciousness into our clothes and bodies through the use of new technology. The focus on waves of the future in design, architecture and technology is accompanied by pseudo-plots against the future, that is, alarms about the future or threats to the future that while seeming to depart from regular or traditional paths of thinking, contribute to the plot against the future because they are in the business of offering alternative streams or visions of threats of things to come rather than allowing difference to emerge in the present. In the next part of my presentation, I'm going to touch briefly on these pseudo-threats. The first is a general and public complaint about the running time of the clock of normal consciousness. It's a complaint about whether the future runs on time, and it's under the heading of we were promised jetpacks. The second is a more specific complaint, an academic dispute about who winds the spring of the clock in the brain of the historian, and it comes under the heading of counterfactual history. Neither of these complaints relates to the complaint that Max Sterer has about the clock, which is that the clock is wrong in principle, because it's the one thing that stands in the way of the things of this world being used in the way stuff like you. Right. We were promised jetpacks. The fact that we were promised jetpacks is also the name of a band, is testament to its universality and its persistence as a rueful, middle-aged, shoulder-shrugging public complaint. The complaint is, of course, that we were promised jetpacks, flying cars, moon bases, cold fusion, and these things never turned up. Darn it. This pseudo-alarm about the future does not want the things in this world to be used in the way the world does not use them. Instead, what it wants is an updated version of our world. The same social and interpersonal arrangements, but seen through Google glasses. Jetpacks instead of backpacks, cars that fly, moon base, not home base. Simple substitutions of materials under the same social regimes of dissatisfaction, the commodity, etc., etc. The very nature of the complaint that we were promised jetpacks and they never arrived is therefore a wish for a euchronia or a hypothetical future condition of the present that can be as cohesive and satisfying as the representation of Merry England. Other contributions to the actual plot against the future come from centres of future studies, departments of future studies, think tanks devoted to the future thinking and future forecasting, and any other organisation that devotes its time to telling us what the future will be like. They are all wrong. To paraphrase Max Sterer's second description of the time machine in Memories of the Future, these are institutional automata. They wind themselves up and they tick on. Their members project their will into the future according to rules that were established in the past. Their illusion of the present, in order to get at the future, forestalls any attempt to intervene in the present so that the things of the future can be used, etc., etc. So, done jetpacks, on time, counterfactual histories. The illusion of the present is also undertaken by certain kinds of intellectual automata called counterfactual histories. Counterfactual histories are straightforward historical narratives of events that never occurred, backroads to alternative futures. They range from the more or less plausible historical alternatives in which Hitler manages to invade England, more speculative ventures into the consequences of pan-European Viking empires that never happened, to the really weird war game scenarios in which one is asked to speculate on what the outcomes for us all would be if Julius Caesar were running present-day North Korea. So, the usual accusation flung at counterfactual histories by good academics like ourselves is that they are not based on conditions of evidence. Counterfactual history is actually not. It's not just not based on evidence. It's not based on anything at all because it has so many possible parameters that you can't even set the conditions for reasoning, really. But counterfactual histories become interesting, I think, when respectable academics flirt with them and begin to take them seriously, thereby disclosing the part that certain kinds of historical consciousness play in the plot against the future. What counterfactual histories do is demonstrate the manner in which the clock of historical narrative is wound up, by showing us how it can be wound back, wound up again, and set off on another tick-tock, tick-tock. The mild to acute flirtation that some academic historians have with counterfactual histories shows this quite clearly. The historian Simon Sharma, in a piece of speculative historical journalism he wrote in 1999, the piece was called "And What If?", said, "If only the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand had met a well-meaning man in a Sarajevo street in June 1914, no First World War, no Hitler, no Stalin, no nuclear weapons, no Sarajevo crisis." Okay, he doesn't really take this seriously, but he's showing us how the words of the historian tick along even if the clock of history has been wound in a new way. He's just said, this is how you can wind the clock. Look, I'm ticking it off for you. And that to me shows the alignment of history and counterfactual history in the consciousness of the historian. In this regard, the historian Robert Fogel once claimed that every historian who has set out to look at the causes of the Civil War in the US has implicitly or explicitly presumed what would have happened if events had taken a different course. So in other words, it's built in to certain kinds of history. You can't think the Civil War without thinking of it counterfactually, according to Robert Fogel anyway. Counterfactual histories are another form of pseudo-alarm about the future, because at first they seem to offer a warning to the complacency of historians, because they emphasize contingency in human affairs and how the terror of uncertainty can be made to emerge within the well-trodden paths of historical narration. The historian Simon T. Kay has argued that, quote him, "Counterfactualism is a powerful corrective that undoes the tendency of history to hide the fact of plausible alternative outcomes and the reflexive importance of uncertainty in human affairs as they occur." In other words, things could have been different. Kay goes so far to argue, and that's scary because things could have been different. Kay goes so far as to argue that counterfactuals can add historical rigour by helping us to dispense with three illusions about history. The first of these illusions, says Kay, is the illusion of indispensability. In other words, the illusion that certain historical events are more important than others. The second is the illusion of causation, the idea that correlation equals causation, which we all know it doesn't. And the third is the illusion of inevitability, the illusion that things were always going to turn out the way they did. And he said, well, that counterfactualism is an antidote to this. But I would say that none of these illusions take into account the greater illusion that binds counterfactual and traditional history together and that defines their contribution to the plot against the future. This is the illusion that history and counterfactual history are related as the rule and the exception to this rule, and that, by the use of counterfactual exceptions, all of us are given more agency when we construct alternative histories. That's an illusion. I don't think we are given more agency in counterfactualism. We're given the illusion of more agency. Right, I'm coming towards the end of my talk now, but I do want to mention Planet Cacanea and the brilliance of Robert Musil. Here we should consider the status of alternatives. Rather than relying on counterfactual history as the alternative to traditional historical narrative, it is worth inquiring whether there are counter-temporal rather than counterfactual means of displacing the clock that stands in the way of the things of this world being used in the way the world does not use them. Earlier, I gave the example from Memories of the Future of how the invisibility cap from the fairy tale is used to effect a separation between the normal state of scientific consciousness and that consciousness as it is recreated in Max's description of his time machine. My question now is there an equivalent to the invisibility cap from the fairy tale for historical and cultural analysis? In other words, is there something that can separate knowledge of how things were in history and how things might have been in history from the recreation of historical knowledge in a form that this world does not use it? This recreation of historical knowledge would enable us to study the relations of the future and the plot against the future within the same framework. It would not offer an historical account of the things of this world used in the way the world uses them, nor would it offer a counterfactual history of some things that could have been different if we existed in a different world. But a good example of the invisibility hat from the fairy tale applied to historical narrative is Robert Musil's Caecania, the name he gives to his recreation of Austria-Hungary in his novel The Man Without Qualities, which Musil began in 1921 and worked on until his death in 1942. Musil was writing on the day he died. His wife said that he had a funny expression on his face when she went in and saw that he was dead, and it was one of surprise and I think frustration that he wasn't able to carry on. The book is constructed around a central character, Ulrich, the man without qualities of the title, who in many ways resembles Musil. Ulrich's a mathematician and a scientist who wants to study things under lab conditions, which is kind of what Musil wanted to do. Caecania, whose name is derived with a humorous Kaka twist from the imperial and royal names of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is the old pre-war Austria-Hungary, recreated by Musil after World War I, but under laboratory conditions in which World War I is taken into account, but in which World War I never happens. This is quite a difficult thing to imagine. He takes the war into account, but it never happens. So it's not a counterfactual history. As Musil puts it, what the story that makes up this novel amounts to is that the story that was supposed to be told in it is not told. The story that was supposed to be told in it is not told. He's not saying, I'm not telling the story. He's saying, I know I was supposed to tell the story, but I'm making a point of not telling it in the story. Musil's book is not a historical account of the decline and fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Neither is it a counterfactual history in which World War I never happened and some different things happened as a consequence. As Nicholas Spice has put it, quote, Caecania must be experienced by the reader as a rudderless balloon drifting in an unreal ether and incapable of arriving at any destination. So it's a lab. Caecania is a device that allowed Musil to write about the condition of Austria-Hungary while stopping the ticking clock of history. This also allowed Musil to study the future and the plot against the future on equal terms, not just by opposing his Caecanian laboratory to the flow of historical events, but by situating this tension between history and the floating bubble within Caecania itself in the form of the mad, pointless ticking clock of the parallel campaign, a commission charged with the task of commemorating the forthcoming 70th anniversary of Franz Josef in 1918, and a campaign in which all the main characters of the book, including Ulrich, get involved. So the parallel campaign is the name for the ticking clock, which Musil puts back into the lab and drives all his rats mad with it. They're all being driven mad by the parallel campaign. So he's taken Austria out of the ticking clock and then puts the ticking clock back on. He's amazing. In The Man Without Qualities, the parallel campaign is the equivalent of Max Sterer's clock. It is the thing that stands in the way of the things of this world being reused. The parallel campaign is, to use one of Musil's favourite images, a kind of fly paper to which the characters in The Man Without Qualities stick. It is what projects their will into the future date of 1918. It is what winds them up for action. It makes them talk and it makes them tick. The tragedy of the book is that none of its characters, even Ulrich, the man without qualities who would rather live life as an essay rather than as a story, none of these characters in the book manages to repeat Musil's trick of telling a story in which the story of the parallel campaign doesn't get told. And that's the lab-based tragedy he constructs in his book. In the face of this failure to make the future appear as a difference in the pseudo-reality of the present, Ulrich becomes, in Musil's words, quote, an important statement that has gone astray. Caecania is the invisibility cap from the fairy tale that allows Musil to stop the clock of history, but no one inside Caconia can build a time machine to escape the parallel campaign. In this way, World War I is fully taken into account in The Man Without Qualities, even though World War I never happens. Unlike Henry James, who thought it was tragic that World War I became instituted as the meaning of what he called the treacherous years that had preceded it, Musil's tragedy is of a different and a higher order. He makes the parallel campaign into the meaning of World War I. World War I becomes quite small in comparison with the demon of the parallel campaign. The collective madness of the parallel campaign is a disease that affects everyone's consciousness of time within Caconia and outside it. So the germ in the lab is the germ outside as well. It is the name for a general plot against the future in which the rearmament and slaughter of World War I is included and bound up. So, my conclusion. Musil's Caconia offers a different kind of experiment with time than the one undertaken by Max Sterer in Memories of the Future. On the one hand, Planet Caconia functions like the invisibility cap by recreating our knowledge of World War I in a form that the world does not use it. Caconia shifts the conditions of our historical knowledge in the present in order to produce its truth of World War I. And that makes it very different, for example, than Simon Schama's flotation with the possibility of a failed assassination of Franz Josef and the possibility of no world war, no Hitler, no Stalin, no nuclear weapons, no Sarajevo, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, Musil creates Planet Caconia as a floating ball in which the plot against the future has been isolated in the form of the parallel campaign. Musil has stopped the clock only in order to isolate the mechanism and show us how the clock works. Where Kurt Zajanowski's Memories of the Future separates the time of the future, which is the time of Max's descriptions of his machine, his different context, from the time of the plot against the future, which is the time of the machine's construction. Musil introduces a snake into the Eden of Caconia in the form of the parallel campaign, which works on the principle that with the names changed, what applies to the characters caught up in the parallel campaign also applies to you. We are all in the parallel campaign. The plot against the future occupies our present, as does the specific relationship that Musil evokes between the parallel campaign and World War I. A glance at the British government's website outlining its plans for this year's centenary of World War I will remind you that this is still the case. There are two policies listed in connection with the centenary on the website. These are, firstly, quote, bringing people together in strong united communities, and secondly, marking relevant national events and ceremonies. If World War I was a continuation of the parallel campaign, then so is the centenary of World War I. Thank you.